There is a picture of the atom that lives inside almost every human mind on this planet. You were shown it in school. A dense little nucleus sitting at the center, and around it, tiny electrons zipping through circular orbits like miniature planets circling a miniature sun. It is a clean picture. It is a satisfying picture. And it is almost entirely wrong. But the solar system model, as embarrassing as it is for modern physics education, is not the deepest error. The deepest error is something quieter, something that slipped past most of your teachers because it slips past most physicists when they first encounter it. It is the idea that an electron spins, not metaphorically spins, literally spins, the way a basketball spins on your fingertip, rotating on an axis, a physical object turning in physical space. That picture is not just a simplification. It is a geometrical impossibility. And once you understand why, you will have touched something genuinely strange about the architecture of nature, something that took the greatest minds of the 20th century years to fully absorb. Let us begin by taking that basketball seriously. If an electron were a tiny sphere, a miniature charged ball rotating on its axis, then the physics of that rotation would have to obey the same equations that govern any spinning charged object. The magnetic field generated by the electron, which is absolutely real and absolutely measurable, would have to emerge from that rotation. Physicists can write down exactly how fast such a sphere would need to spin to produce the observed magnetic moment of an electron. They did that calculation. The answer is not surprising. The answer is catastrophic. For a sphere the size of the electron, meaning a sphere with a radius on the order of the classical electron radius, the surface at the equator would need to be moving at roughly 100 times the speed of light. 100 times, not approaching the speed of light, not 99% of the speed of light. 100 times faster than the absolute cosmic speed limit enshrined in special relativity. The surface of the spinning electron would be violating the foundational constraint of spacetime itself. Now, you might say, well, perhaps the electron is just smaller than that classical radius. Perhaps it is a much tinier sphere, and the equator is moving slower because the circumference is smaller. But here is where nature closes every exit. Every experiment ever devised, every collision at every particle accelerator from CERN to Fermilab has probed the electron to extraordinary precision. The electron has no measurable size. It behaves, in every experimental context, as a point particle. Not a small sphere, not a fuzzy blob, a mathematical point, a dimensionless object with zero spatial extent, zero radius. And this is where the mind properly stumbles. Because if the electron has zero radius, then the question of how fast its surface is spinning is not just unanswerable. The question is meaningless. There is no surface. There is no equator. There is no rotating structure in space. You cannot spin something that occupies no space. The geometry simply does not exist. So what is electron spin? The honest answer is that spin is a property, an intrinsic property, a built-in fundamental characteristic of the electron that has no classical analog whatsoever. Physicists call it intrinsic angular momentum, and the word intrinsic is doing enormous work there. It does not mean angular momentum that came from somewhere, angular momentum acquired by rotation, angular momentum stored in the motion of physical parts. It means angular momentum that is simply there as a fixed feature of the particle itself. The way mass is a fixed feature of the particle, the way electric charge is a fixed feature of the particle. Electrons carry exactly 1/2 unit of spin in the language of quantum mechanics. And that number, that 1/2, is not arbitrary. It is baked into the mathematical identity of what an electron is. You cannot remove it. You cannot zero it out. You cannot give an electron zero spin any more than you can give it zero charge and still call it an electron. Spin is not a state the electron is in. Spin is part of what the electron is. But why? Why does a point particle carry angular momentum at all? To answer that, you need to step back from the particle picture entirely and think about electrons the way modern physics actually thinks about them, not as little balls, but as excitations in a quantum field. Quantum field theory tells us that underlying all of reality, underlying every particle you have ever encountered, are fields. Not force fields in the everyday sense, quantum fields, mathematical structures that fill all of space-time. The electron field stretches across the entire universe. When energy is concentrated in that field in just the right way, what we perceive as an electron flickers into existence. The electron is not a thing moving through the field. The electron is a localized pattern, a knot, a vibration in the electron field itself. Now, the electron field is not a simple scalar field, not the kind of field you might use to describe temperature varying smoothly across a room where every point in space just has a single number attached to it. The electron field is a spinor field, and a spinor is one of the most mathematically exotic objects in all of physics. To understand why spinors are strange, you need to think carefully about geometry, specifically about how objects behave under rotation. In the ordinary world, if you pick up a coffee mug and rotate it 360 degrees, one full turn, it comes back to exactly the state it started in. Everything is the same. The handle is back where it began. Nothing has changed. This seems so obvious it barely deserves stating. But this obvious fact is actually a special property of the mathematical objects we use to describe ordinary three-dimensional space. Most objects, most fields, most wave functions return to their original state after a full rotation. Spinors do not. A spinor under a rotation of 360 degrees does not return to its original state. It picks up a minus sign. Its mathematical description flips. After one full rotation, the spinor describing the electron is the negative of what it was before. To get back to the original state, you have to rotate not once around the full circle, but twice, 720 degrees, 2 complete rotations. Only then does the spinor return to precisely what it was. This is not a mathematical quirk with no physical consequence. This strange double rotation property is why the Pauli exclusion principle exists. It is why electrons cannot pile on top of each other the way photons can. It is why atoms have structure, why the periodic table has the shape it has, why chemistry is possible at all, why matter does not collapse into a featureless soup. The geometry of quantum spin is not a footnote. It is holding the architecture of the material world together. But the visual picture of 720 degrees still resists ordinary intuition. Here is a way to feel it. Take a glass of water. Hold it flat on your palm, arm extended. Now, without spilling, rotate your arm so that the glass travels in a full 360-degree loop, going under and around. If you do this correctly, your arm is now twisted. The glass is back in front of you, but your elbow is pointing awkwardly inward and your shoulder is under tension. Your body is now in a different topological state. Take it around another full 360 degrees in the same direction, and now something remarkable happens. Your arm unwinds. You are back to your original comfortable posture. 2 full rotations to return to the start. This is not a party trick. This is a physical demonstration of spinor geometry. Your arm, threaded through the surrounding space, traces out the same topological structure that a spinor traces through the mathematical space it inhabits. The system is not simply rotating in isolation. It is rotating while remaining connected to everything around it, and that connectivity enforces the double rotation rule. The electron field has exactly this character. The electron is not just sitting in space, spinning indifferently. It is a feature of a field that is threaded through the geometry of space-time itself, and the topology of that threading means one rotation is never enough. Now, where did this profound insight actually come from? The story leads to one of the most beautiful equations in all of physics, written down by Paul Dirac in 1928. Dirac was attempting to do something that seemed modest, to write a version of the quantum wave equation for the electron that properly incorporated the rules of special relativity. Schrödinger had already written a wave equation for the electron, but it did not transform correctly under the symmetries of relativity. Dirac wanted a relativistically consistent version, what he found astonished even him, to make the equation work, to make it transform correctly under all the symmetries that special relativity demands. Dirac could not use ordinary numbers, and he could not use ordinary vectors. The mathematics forced him to use matrices, 4x4 matrices, and the wave function describing the electron was not a single number at each point in space. It had to be a four-component object, a four-component spinor, a mathematical structure with four independent values at every point. Two of those components describe the electron with spin pointing upward. Two describe the electron with spin pointing downward. And the other two, the ones Dirac initially tried to dismiss as unphysical, turned out to describe something no one had imagined: the anti-electron, the positron. Antimatter fell out of Dirac's equation not as a deliberate prediction, but as a mathematical inevitability. The equation demanded it. The point is this: spin was not inserted into the Dirac equation. Spin emerged from it. The intrinsic angular momentum of the electron, this property with no classical spinning analog, was a direct consequence of demanding consistency between quantum mechanics and special relativity. Nature, it turns out, cannot have a relativistically consistent quantum electron without spin. The geometry of spacetime, the same geometry that enforces the speed of light limit that kills the classical spinning sphere model, is also the geometry that generates spin as a necessary property in the first place. There is a deep irony lodged in here. The very principle that destroys the spinning electron picture, special relativity, is also the principle that explains why spin must exist. Relativity does not just rule out the classical model. It replaces it with something stranger and more precise. So what is the electron actually doing? Let us be completely honest. The electron is a quantized excitation of a spinor field. It is a localized pattern in a mathematical field that carries angular momentum, not because it is rotating, but because the field itself, by its mathematical nature, its spinorial nature, carries angular momentum as an intrinsic geometric feature. When you measure the spin of an electron, you are not catching it mid-rotation. You are interacting with a field excitation whose mathematical structure has a built-in asymmetry that manifests in your detector as a definite angular momentum value. The electron is not spinning. The electron is what spinning looks like when you strip away all the physics that makes ordinary spinning possible: the size, the shape, the mechanical rotation of parts in space, and keep only the pure mathematical essence of angular momentum, the group theoretic structure, the representation theory, the transformation properties under rotation. What is left when you distill angular momentum down to its barest mathematical bones is a spinor. And a spinor is what an electron is. This is not a failure of knowledge. This is a success of understanding. When Dirac wrote his equation, when the spinor structure emerged from relativistic consistency, physics crossed a threshold. It moved from describing particles as tiny versions of familiar macroscopic objects to describing them as irreducible features of mathematical fields whose properties have no macroscopic counterpart at all. The electron has no counterpart in your everyday experience. Not a baseball, not a basketball, not a gyroscope, not a top. No analogy drawn from the rotating objects of daily life will be accurate, because those objects rotate by virtue of being extended in space, by virtue of having parts that move relative to each other. The electron has none of that. It is a point. It has no parts. It has no mechanical structure that can rotate. Its angular momentum is not a consequence of its internal configuration. It is a consequence of its mathematical identity. This is the real lesson hidden inside the misconception of electron spin. The universe is not built from small versions of the objects we encounter in daily life. The universe is built from mathematical structures, quantum fields, with properties so geometrically exotic that we have no language for them except mathematics itself. Every analogy eventually breaks. The spinning basketball, the waiter's tray, the twisting arm, these are scaffolding temporary structures to help the mind climb toward the actual idea. But the actual idea is not a spinning object. It is not a rotating anything. It is a spinor field filling all of space-time, vibrating in patterns that carry energy and momentum, and angular momentum as built-in properties of the field's geometry, excitations that show up in our detectors as particles, as electrons, as the very matter from which your hand and eye and brain are composed, reading these words. The electron that your chemistry teacher told you was spinning is not spinning. It is something far more extraordinary than a spinning particle ever could have been. It is a localized quantum of a relativistic spinor field, carrying angular momentum not as a motion but as a mathematical fact, anchored not in the rotation of parts, but in the topological structure of quantum geometry itself, demanding 720 degrees for a full return, holding the entire periodic table in place by that strange demand, and doing all of this while occupying, as best we can measure, precisely no space at all. That is not a lie cleaned up. That is reality, finally seen without the training wheels.